Hello there folks, my name is Robin Nichols and I'm a teacher and instructor with Brian's School of Photography. Now, just very briefly, I teach Photoshop CC classes, I teach Photoshop Elements, I teach a new class called Photoshop CC Projects, and I also teach a DSLR video class with Brian's School of Photography. That's what I look like, that's enough about me. What we really want to have a look at is these 5 completely different images submitted for feedback and critique. So we're going to kick off with an image called Saugatuck, have I murdered that pronunciation? Probably. Sent in by Tom Reddish. Now Tom writes, he got away from Chicago for a couple of days, 2-day vacation with his wife, who loves it. Okay, so she likes it and he's not too crazy about it and wants a more objective opinion. Thanks very much, Tom, dropping me right in it there. So anyway, we'll press on. The thing about sunsets and sunrises, and indeed, any kind of, crazy climatic event, I suppose, is they often appeal at the time because you're, as you say here, you're out of Chicago for a couple of days. So that's got to be a good thing, yeah? Chicago is a very, very big, busy, built-up area. And so just simply going down to a beach where you've got waves lapping on the sand, you've got wind whistling through the vegetation, and you've only got one person on the beach as far as I can see. Maybe that's your wife there. I don't know. Maybe you've locked the kids up at home and you've got rid of them, and you've just left them at home for a couple of days. So, you're completely free and you're in a new environment. So it's like a long vacation, really, even though, as you say, it's 2 days. So the thing is, what happens then is you begin to feel a bit warm and fuzzy. Then the sunset arrives. You go, oh, that's really nice. You snap a couple of pictures. You may go off and have a nice meal or something. And you come home with warm, fuzzy recollection of that weekend. Certainly that's what your wife tells us here. The irony is that the images, when you download them onto your computer, don't really back that up, and that happens time and time again. And I get to see so many sunsets, for writing for various magazines here in Australia. People write, so here's my sunset, and you think, well, yeah, it's the sun and it's setting, but that's about it. And it's usually out of somebody's top bedroom window, and in the foreground you have layers of roof lines and all sorts of power cables and stuff like that, and all we can see in the shot is the sun and maybe a little bit of a reflection or something, and that's what our consciousness really sort of focuses on. So there are a couple of things we can do here immediately. Number one is, Tom, you need to take your wife away for another 2-day vacation and try again. That's what I would suggest. It's not a bad picture, but it's not an interesting picture because it's very, very similar to the tens of thousands of other sunset pictures. How would you make a sunset picture more interesting? Number one is probably don't put the sun in the middle of your picture. Number two, don't include so much dead area in the foreground. I understand that the shapes of these, I don't know what they're called, they're sort of like coastal grasses, aren't they? These are very hardy grasses that grow on sand dunes. The shapes of those are really quite interesting, okay? But they're completely dead because, of course, there's no light. You could put the camera on a tripod, make a long exposure and experiment with a flashlight, and you could just paint light into some of the dark, shady areas, if you were in this situation again. Look at the sky. The sky is completely and utterly dead. There's nothing there on the left-hand side of the sunset. There's just, so that's half the picture, gone. It's just not interesting. So if you were to crop this picture heavily from the left-hand side and basically remove 95% of that dead sky area and crop so that the sun is now over on the extreme left-hand side, you've got a more interesting sky. Bingo. So basically zoom in on the shot and include the interesting stuff. And that's the whole thing about zooming, lens selection, and post-production cropping. The whole point of this, the whole thing there is to exclude stuff that doesn't help you in the picture. And that's what's happening. The left-hand side of the picture is as dead as a doormat. The right-hand side has got more interesting elements in it, but it certainly needs a little bit more help. So there are a number of things you can do here. Another thing to consider is to shoot with a tripod and a neutral density filter. And what that will do is, even though this is an evening shot, it's going to extend your exposure to an insanely long time. And the reason you would do that is, number one is you can shoot at a reasonable ISO, like 100 or 200 or 400 ISO. Set your camera to about f8 or f11, which is probably the sweet spot for pretty much most lenses, i.e. the sharpest point on most lenses, and let the shutter take control. And so you may end up with a 15 or a 30-second exposure. What that does is turn the water, the ocean, into almost like a mill, but not quite, but like a very smooth, almost as if it's been frozen. And so you get a most amazing glassy effect, which will enhance reflections from clouds and, of course, the sunset. Anyway, look, I've witted on for quite long enough. I understand the emotions behind this kind of a photograph. It just doesn't do it because of all those things. It's missing a lot of those elements. Thanks very much for your submission. On to the next one, which is a pretty startling shot here, isn't it? And we're just going to go backwards and have a look. This is called Reach for the Sky, I Wonder Why, written by Show B. So I hope I've read that right. And the photographer says here, it's a windy day in the tops of the cliffs in Sussex. Cool, blimey, in the UK. Hello. Right. So the challenge was getting the shot at the height of the jump, and you're using a 6D 24-105 f4 lens, f16 at 200th of a second. Excellent. I have to say this is really, really good because it's insanely difficult to press the shutter at the right time. I'm assuming you've got the camera set to sequence shooting mode, so you're going bang, 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 you know, while your model is flying through the air. So I appreciate that. It's very, very hard. What is even harder, though, is to get the limbs in the right position. Now, you know, what is the right position and what is the wrong position? That's a really hard one for anybody to judge. But I think what we can see here is the arms and the legs are not overlapping. They're in a very dynamic pose. So this person is obviously a dancer or a yoga enthusiast or just a general all-round athlete, because very, very muscled, and you know, to be able to jump like that's pretty interesting, pretty spectacular. The hair is I actually love it because it covers the facial features completely, you know, the ears or eyes or whatever, so that you can't see any detail, even though the head is going to be facing away from the camera. So you've got this kind of anonymity in the image, as well as this sort of complete dynamic flavour. What's also interesting from a technical point of view is it's actually quite sharp. I see from the metadata, this is only a 200th of a second. I would, if somebody said to me, look, I'm going to jump off a cliff and I want you to get a shot of me freezing the action, I would have said 1,000th of a second or 2,000th of a second. So 200th of a second is pretty good. So I'm assuming this is kind of at the apex of the leap. So the figure has kind of just jumped up and then stopped, and then you know, just at the point where they hit the highest point, and then they begin to go down again. And that's why you can get that frozen. There's a little bit of movement in the right foot. Is that negative? No, I don't think it is. It actually makes it look a little bit more realistic, I think. So stunning image. How would you improve that? Gosh, I would crop it ever so slightly so that the grassy verge or the grassy cliff edge or whatever just touches the left-hand corner of the picture. Having a diagonal running into, or an angle running into a corner of a picture, is quite a dynamic thing to do in terms of composition. Otherwise, I think this is a tremendous looking picture. What I also find amazing is that you've found a day where the sun's out in England. There you go. But very, very good job. Well done. Okay, now we're going to move on to an image called Hot Air Balloon Basket Silhouette by M. Diamant. M. Diamant, you're in Dordogne region of France. Very nice. The pilot manoeuvred the balloon over the landing zone of dried cut sunflower stalks. This is kind of interesting. Let's have a look here. This is kind of interesting because, again, like the sunsets, I see so many pictures of balloons, balloon fairs, balloon festivals, balloon events, balloons taking off, balloons landing, balloons being pumped up, all that kind of stuff. You never, ever, ever see, I can't remember seeing a picture of a balloon which is just a silhouette. So you've changed the subject matter, or the way of approaching the subject matter, completely by shooting the silhouette rather than the obvious, which is photographing the balloon. Now, if you're in the balloon, it's kind of hard to photograph the balloon that you're in unless you just photograph directly upwards. So you probably don't have any option but to do this. But it's very interesting to change the point of view, to change the aspect of the whole point of the photograph is to record a silhouette travelling across the countryside here. I think that's a great thing to do. You could also make this much, much darker, I think. Let's just see what comments you make here. But I think you could, in post-production, make it much darker. So you're the silhouette on the far right of the basket. I kind of knew that anyway. Yeah, I had a feeling. You know, you can darken it down so that you get much darker shadow, and therefore the sunlight areas of the image would be much more enriched, much richer looking colour. That's what I would suggest. There's a tiny little bit of something, maybe it's the basket or something on the bottom left of the picture. I would crop that out a little bit. But otherwise, you know, interesting. It's just an unusual point of view. It's an unusual way of treating a subject, which is a very obvious subject. So kind of good. You know, we often miss that. And some of the masters of photography obviously clock into that whole thing about, rather than photographing, let's say, people wandering around the city, they'll have photographs of the reflections or the shadows of people wandering around a city. You know, the people will be in the photograph, of course, but it's more about the shadows that they cast on the environment that is a kind of more interesting thing. So well done. Okay, and then we're going to move along to one called Summer Along the Potomac, by Amy Doherty. Now, Amy, let me have a look at here. Wow. Okay, so here we go with another sunset shot. And I shouldn't say another sunset shot, because this is pretty spectacular. Let's just go back and see what Amy says. So one of the challenges of getting this shot was capturing the great dynamic range of the sky. You're not wrong there. Monuments stopping the motion of the paddlers at the same time. So this is 3 bracketed shots, and she says she struggles sometimes knowing where to meter to get the best results, especially when dealing with a wide range such as this and the moving target. Yes, well, you don't make life easy for yourself. So she used Photomatics Pro, I guess, to combine the photos, shooting with the Nikon 70-200 lens. Is there an acceptable amount of clipping when I get to the editing? Hope to print and sell this one. Okay, right. So one of the things is dynamic range. Most digital cameras can only capture, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 stops of dynamic range. It depends on who you ask, whether they work for Nikon or whether it's you know, the owner of the camera. So there's a big difference between the dynamic range of a scene, which may be 10, 11, 12, 13 f-stops, and your camera, which can only capture, let's say, 9 f-stops of contrast. And so what that leaves us with is an awful lot of jet black parts of the image in the shadows and an awful lot of overexposed or clipped white parts. Now, even shooting in bracketed exposures, which Amy has done here, you're never going to get much detail in that highlight area where the sun is, because that's like 1 billion degrees Celsius. It's so off the scale in terms of dynamic range compared to the rest of the scene that it's not going to happen. However, I think you've done an amazing job of getting that. You know, yes, you could have an increased dynamic range using Photomatics to actually see what's under the arches of the bridge, maybe, but is that vital to the success of the shot? I don't think so. So this is, to me, coming back to the sunset theme, is really what a sunset's all about. The sun is setting and it's illuminated the sky. All right, it's a reasonably interesting sky. It's not the best looking sky, but it's reasonably interesting. You've got a bit of cloud cover, you've got a monumental great building, you've got a bridge, a whole lot of sort of dynamic things happening in the image. I think, and just off the top of my head, I think this needs to be rotated ever so slightly counterclockwise, because it looks to me like it's not straight. Now, that might be one of these optical illusions where the building that we're looking at looks like it's a little bit off horizontal, as does the bank of the river on the other side. It may just be an optical illusion caused by the line of the bridge going across. I don't know, but that's what I'm just feeling. Second thing is, if you know, to make an image a little bit more dynamic, is possibly to have, you know, you've got figures in the image. You know, somebody who's just about to either stand up, fall over, or sort of launch himself forward on. I don't know, what is that? Is that a skiff? Is that a surfboard? I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, so they're on this plank in the middle of the Potomac, and I think they need to be bigger. So again, it's very easy for me to sit in my office and say, well, you know, they should be bigger in the picture. Very easy for me to do that. You know, it's impossible to get that unless you know these people and get them to paddle around again and come closer to the camera, because they're kind of a little bit lost in the scene. Having said that, though, they also are kind of interesting because they put a little bit of scale into the scene, because otherwise you don't really know how big this bridge is on the right-hand side. It's kind of hard to judge. You've got little street lights for sure across the parapet there, but otherwise it's kind of hard to get a sense of the proportion. So kind of interesting, and beautiful water in the foreground. So that's what I'm saying. I think it's you've chosen an opportunistic night. The sunset is pretty good. I don't think the HDR processing is quite enough. I think you could reveal a little bit more detail, maybe texture inside the bridge, especially because essentially the bridge and the building in the background pretty flat and boring, aren't they? I mean, the light has gone from them because they're silhouetted from behind. So I think they need a little bit more dynamic lighting or dynamic feel to them. Okay, but otherwise great, really interesting effect there. Well done. And finally, we get Robert G. Harris's Gooseberry Mesa. I just love that name, Gooseberry. I was raised as an English person, was raised on gooseberry pie in England. So I'm quite sure you don't have gooseberries over here, or maybe there may be something else that's called a gooseberry. So located in Utah near a place called Hurricane. Gosh, what a cool name. I guess it's very windy there. So this is spectacular mesa, isn't it? This is an amazing looking, I'd call it a mountain, but it's a very eroded, revealing that amazing strips of geology, different, I suppose, iron and elements in the rock face there. Now, one of the problems I have with landscapes, and I have it with my own landscapes particularly, is the position of the landscape. Why do we shoot a landscape? Well, it's a big landscape. We're generally, in this shot, we're looking at the mountain ranges off in the distance, so there's an awful lot of stuff in the foreground, and really it's all about the mountain Gooseberry Mesa and that amazing sky. So I would suggest a fairly radical crop through the base of this image, because the bushes in the foreground, maybe there's the gooseberry bushes, I don't know, the bushes in the foreground don't add a great deal to the picture. They're not outstandingly pretty, colourful, interesting shape, and the lighting is not terribly good. They're just lit with the light that's available. So having said that, what I would suggest is to crop it maybe just so that we get rid of the immediate foreground, the bushes, and we have this sort of strip of scrubland just at the very base of the mountain. So you end up with a picture that looks more like a panorama format. No bad thing, I think, because this is a massive panorama. So it's kind of psychologically, we may expect to see a sweeping panorama format presenting this panoramic view, if you follow my logic. A square shot, for example, would not work unless you had an outstandingly interesting foreground object or subject. So what I'm saying is stretch it out to be a more of a panorama format by cropping that base in the foreground. If you had a magnificent cactus growing, if you had fantastic flowering shrubs or something in the foreground, yes, by all means leave it in. But at the moment, I think it's just like, it's just bushes in the foreground. They're not terribly interesting. They might even be dead, or it's the wrong season. So concentrate on what's most interesting and important in the picture, which is this line of mountains and that magnificent sky, which is fabulous. Otherwise, it's a great shot. Looks like a place you want to get on a plane and go to, actually. So very, very spectacular. And well done. And that is pretty much everything we have to say on those 5 pictures. Thank you very much for everybody to submit your images, and let's see how we go.